We've all been there, ignoring that nagging worry, telling ourselves it's nothing serious. Margaret Henderson, at 65, had spent years brushing off the little things her body threw at her, convincing herself that getting older meant accepting these small mysteries. She noticed a stubborn spot on her back, but figured it was just another blemish that came with age. When she finally visited her local clinic, she expected a quick look and maybe some cream. The nurse took one glance at her back and went completely silent. Margaret had never seen a medical professional look so stunned. The silence stretched on, making Margaret's heart pound in a way that had nothing to do with her blood pressure. What could be so shocking about a simple spot that it would leave a trained nurse speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Henderson had always prided herself on being practical. At 65, she'd weathered enough of life's storms to know the difference between real problems and the kind of worry that kept people awake at night for no good reason. Her small apartment on Maple Street reflected this sensible approach. Everything in its place, bills paid on time, and a kitchen that smelled perpetually of Earl Grey tea and the lavender soap she'd used for 30 years. The worn silver hand mirror on her dresser had been her constant companion through decades of changes. She'd watched her brown hair turn silver in that mirror, seen laugh lines deepen around her green eyes, and observed the gradual softening of a face that had once been called beautiful. The mirror never lied, but it had also become her accomplice, in a peculiar form of selective blindness. 3 weeks earlier, Margaret had noticed the spot while struggling to reach a zipper on her favorite navy dress. Her fingers had brushed against something rough on her back, just below her left shoulder blade. When she twisted around to catch a glimpse in the mirror, she saw what looked like a dark, slightly raised blemish about the size of a dime. Just another age spot, she'd muttered, adjusting the dress and dismissing the discovery as quickly as she'd made it. Margaret's relationship with her body had evolved over the decades into something resembling a cordial but distant friendship. After her husband Robert's death from pancreatic cancer 5 years ago, she'd made peace with the idea that bodies were temporary vessels, prone to mysterious aches, odd bumps, and the gradual wearing down that came with time. She'd nursed Robert through his final months, watching his once strong frame diminish, and had emerged from that experience with a peculiar combination of acceptance and avoidance. Her daily routine reflected this philosophy. Every morning at 7 sharp, she'd brew her tea, toast a single slice of whole-grain bread, and read the local paper while classical music played softly from the old radio Robert had given her for their 20th anniversary. She'd water her 3 potted plants, a spider plant, a philodendron, and a stubborn African violet that bloomed sporadically, and then settle into her favorite armchair with whatever library book she'd selected for the week. The spot on her back became an unwelcome addition to this routine. Each morning while dressing, her hand would unconsciously drift to the area, feeling the raised surface that seemed neither to improve nor worsen. It was simply there, like an uninvited houseguest who'd overstayed their welcome but wasn't causing enough trouble to warrant eviction. Margaret's neighbor, Dorothy Chen, had a different perspective on such matters. At 72, Dorothy approached health concerns with the enthusiasm of a detective solving a case. She collected medical articles, maintained detailed records of her blood pressure readings, and had what she called a relationship with her doctor that involved quarterly check-ins and immediate attention to any bodily irregularity. "You can't just ignore these things, Margaret," Dorothy had said during one of their weekly coffee sessions in Margaret's kitchen. They'd been discussing Dorothy's recent mammogram when Margaret had mentioned the spot, almost casually, as if testing the waters of someone else's medical wisdom. Dorothy had leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp with concern. "How long have you had it?" "A few weeks. It's nothing dramatic. Probably just dry skin or something that got irritated." "Have you shown it to anyone?" Margaret had stirred her tea with unnecessary attention to the task. Who would I show it to? It's on my back. I can barely see it myself. A doctor. Margaret. You show these things to a doctor. The word doctor carried weight in Margaret's life that she rarely acknowledged. Her last visit to Dr. Martinez had been 18 months ago, for the annual physical that her insurance required and her practical nature demanded. She'd emerged from that appointment with a clean bill of health and a vague sense of having dodged some unspoken bullet, the way one might feel after successfully navigating a particularly treacherous stretch of highway. But medical visits reminded her too sharply of Robert's illness. The sterile hallways, the hushed conversations with specialists, the gradual accumulation of bad news delivered in careful, professional tones. She'd spent months in waiting rooms, learning to read the subtle signs in doctors' faces before they spoke, becoming fluent in the language of cautious optimism and gentle preparation for difficult realities. After Robert's death, Margaret had made an unspoken pact with herself to avoid medical drama. She took her prescribed blood pressure medication, maintained a reasonable diet, and walked 3 miles every other day around the neighborhood park. Beyond that, she preferred to let sleeping dogs lie. The mirror on her dresser reflected this philosophy back to her each morning. She'd learned to look past the things that didn't require immediate attention, the deepening lines around her mouth, the brown spots on her hands, the general settling that gravity imposed on a body that had lived through decades of ordinary wear and tear. The spot on her back had simply joined this category of acknowledged but unexamined realities. Margaret's son David called every Sunday afternoon at precisely 2 o'clock, a ritual they'd established after Robert's funeral. These conversations followed a predictable pattern. David would ask about her health, her activities, and whether she needed anything. Margaret would provide brief, reassuring responses designed to confirm that she was managing well and required no additional attention or worry. During their most recent call, David had detected something in her voice that prompted him to press gently for details. "You sound tired, Mom. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine, dear. Just the usual aches and pains that come with the territory." "Any new concerns? You know I worry about you living alone." Margaret had hesitated, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the spot through her sweater. "There is one small thing. Just a little bump on my back. Probably nothing, but I suppose I should have someone take a look." The relief in David's voice had been immediate. "I'm glad you're being proactive. Dr. Martinez is still your primary care physician, right? You should give his office a call." After hanging up, Margaret had sat in her chair for a long time, watching the afternoon light shift across her living room walls. The conversation had committed her to a course of action she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but she recognized the logic in David's gentle urging. At 65, she'd reached an age where vigilance was practical, even when it felt like unnecessary worry. The appointment with Dr. Martinez was scheduled for the following Tuesday, but when Margaret called, his receptionist informed her that the doctor was attending a medical conference and wouldn't be available for 2 weeks. However, the clinic's nurse practitioner, Sarah Mitchell, could see her that morning if it was urgent. Margaret had hesitated. The word urgent seemed too dramatic for her situation, but the prospect of waiting another 2 weeks felt unnecessarily prolonged. She'd accepted the appointment with Sarah, a decision that now, sitting in the clinical waiting room, felt both sensible and slightly presumptuous. The waiting room at Riverside Medical Center carried the distinctive smell of industrial cleaner, layered over something vaguely medicinal. Margaret sat in a blue vinyl chair, her purse balanced precisely on her lap, observing the quiet efficiency of the reception staff and the steady parade of patients moving through the system with practiced familiarity. At exactly 9:30, a young woman in navy scrubs called her name. Sarah Mitchell appeared to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and the kind of warm smile that immediately put nervous patients at ease. "Mrs. Henderson?" I'm Sarah. Thank you for coming in this morning." As they walked down the hallway towards examination room 3, Sarah maintained the gentle conversation that medical professionals use to help patients settle into the clinical environment. "Dr. Martinez speaks very highly of you. He mentioned you've been his patient for several years. Since my husband and I moved to the neighborhood. That's been about 12 years now. And what brings you in today?" Margaret found herself explaining the situation with the same practical tone she might use to describe a minor household repair. "There's a spot on my back that I've been keeping an eye on. My son thought I should have someone take a look." Sarah nodded, making notes on her tablet as they entered the examination room. "How long have you noticed it?" "About 3 weeks, maybe a month. It's hard to reach, so I can't see it very well myself." "Any changes in size, color, or texture?" Margaret paused, realizing that her casual attention to the spot hadn't included the kind of systematic observation that medical professionals expected. "I'm not sure. It feels about the same, but I haven't been measuring it or anything like that." Sarah's manner remained reassuring as she gestured toward the examination table. "That's perfectly normal. Most people aren't trained to monitor these things systematically. That's what we're here for. If you'd like to remove your shirt and bra, I'll take a look." The clinical routine of undressing and settling onto the paper-covered examination table felt both familiar and strange. Margaret had navigated countless medical appointments during Robert's illness, but always as the anxious observer rather than the patient. The role reversal carried an odd vulnerability that she hadn't anticipated. Sarah washed her hands thoroughly, pulled on latex gloves, and approached with the gentle professionalism that characterized good medical care. "I'm going to examine the area you mentioned, and then I'll take a look at your general skin condition. Let me know if anything feels uncomfortable." Margaret felt the cool touch of Sarah's gloved hands as she located the spot. The examination seemed to take longer than expected, with Sarah using what felt like unusual care in her inspection. Margaret couldn't see Sarah's expression, but she became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere of the room, a quality of attention that felt more intense than she'd anticipated for a routine skin check. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying a note that made Margaret's attention sharpen. "I'm going to need to get a closer look at this area. I'd like to use a dermatoscope. It's a special magnifying lens that helps us examine skin lesions more carefully." The word lesion hung in the air like a small thunderclap. Margaret had expected words like spot or blemish, not the clinical terminology that suggested something more serious than a minor skin irregularity. "Is there something wrong?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sarah's response was carefully measured. "I want to get a better look before I say anything. Definitive. The dermatoscope will help me see details that aren't visible to the naked eye." Margaret waited while Sarah retrieved the instrument from a drawer, a small device that looked like a sophisticated magnifying glass with its own light source. The examination that followed was thorough and silent, punctuated only by the soft clicks of Sarah adjusting the focus and the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. As the minutes stretched on, Margaret found her mind wandering to Robert's first symptoms, the vague fatigue he'd dismissed as work stress, the occasional stomach discomfort he'd attributed to getting older. She remembered how they'd both participated in the comfortable fiction that small problems would resolve themselves if given enough time and cheerful neglect. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said, setting the dermatoscope aside and moving to where Margaret could see her face. "I'd like Dr. Martinez to take a look at this when he returns from his conference. In the meantime, I'm going to refer you to a dermatologist for a more specialized evaluation." The practical part of Margaret's mind immediately began calculating the implications. Additional appointments, more waiting rooms, the gradual escalation from routine concern to something requiring specialists. But another part of her, the part that had learned to recognize the subtle signs of medical gravity during Robert's illness, was registering the careful way Sarah was choosing her words. "Is it something serious?" Margaret asked, pulling her shirt back on with movements that felt slightly unsteady. Sarah sat down on the small, rolling stool that put her at Margaret's eye level, a positioning that Margaret recognized as the setup for a conversation that required careful attention. "I can see why you'd want a clear answer, and I wish I could give you one right now. What I can tell you is that the area has some characteristics that warrant a closer look by someone with specialized training." "What kind of characteristics?" "The shape is somewhat irregular, and there are color variations that I'd like a dermatologist to evaluate. It could be something completely benign, many skin changes are, but it's the kind of thing that benefits from expert assessment." Margaret absorbed this information with the same practical approach she'd applied to household crises and financial planning throughout her adult life. Problems had solutions, and solutions required accurate information gathered by qualified people using proper procedures. The anxiety that lurked beneath this rational framework was familiar but manageable. "How quickly should I see this dermatologist?" "I'll call Dr. Reynolds' office this afternoon and explain the situation. They're usually very good about working people in when there's a medical referral. You should hear from them by tomorrow." As Margaret gathered her purse and prepared to leave, Sarah handed her a sheet of paper with information about monitoring skin changes and a small card with Dr. Reynolds' contact information. "Try not to worry too much," Sarah added, walking Margaret to the door. "You did the right thing by coming in to have it checked. That's exactly what you're supposed to do." The drive home took Margaret through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, past the coffee shop where she and Dorothy met weekly, the small park where she took her walks, and the grocery store where she'd shopped for decades. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, but Margaret felt as though she were observing it all through a subtle filter that made ordinary things seem somehow more significant. Back in her apartment, she made a cup of tea and sat in her usual chair. But the routine felt different now. The hand mirror on her dresser seemed to regard her with a new kind of attention, as if it too were waiting to see what would unfold in the coming days. Margaret thought about calling David to update him on the appointment, but she realized she didn't yet have enough information to make the call worthwhile. "The nurse wants me to see a specialist," felt both too alarming and insufficiently specific. She decided to wait until after she'd spoken with Dr. Reynolds' office. Instead, she called Dorothy, who answered on the second ring with her characteristic enthusiasm for any news that broke the routine of an ordinary day. "How did the appointment go?" "The nurse wants me to see a dermatologist. She said there are some things about the spot that warrant a specialist's opinion." Dorothy's response was immediate and practical. "Well, that's exactly what you'd want her to say. Better to be thorough than to miss something important. When's the appointment?" "I don't have one yet. They're supposed to call me tomorrow." "And how are you feeling about all this?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Nervous, I suppose, but also relieved to be taking action rather than just wondering about it. That's the right attitude. You know, my cousin Helen had something similar a few years ago. Turned out to be nothing serious, but she was glad she had it checked." After hanging up, Margaret spent the rest of the day maintaining her usual activities, while a small part of her attention remained focused on the spot she couldn't see. She watered her plants, prepared a simple lunch, and spent an hour reading, but found herself occasionally touching the area through her shirt, as if she might detect some change through her fingertips. The evening news provided its usual mixture of distant crises and local weather, but Margaret found her attention drifting to a story about advances in cancer treatment. The word cancer hadn't been spoken during her appointment with Sarah, but it hovered at the edges of her consciousness like an uninvited guest who might or might not decide to stay. As she prepared for bed, Margaret caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and found herself really looking at her face for the first time in months. The woman looking back at her appeared composed and practical, someone who could handle whatever information the coming days might bring. but her eyes also held a quality of attention that hadn't been there that morning. The look of someone who was no longer taking her body's small mysteries for granted. She applied her usual nighttime moisturizer, brushed her teeth, and arranged her medications in their weekly dispenser, but each routine task felt slightly more deliberate, as if she were paying closer attention to the ordinary rituals of self-care. Before turning off the light, Margaret looked once more at the hand mirror on her dresser. Tomorrow, she would wait for a phone call that would set in motion a series of appointments and evaluations that might change her understanding of her own health. Tonight, she would try to sleep with the knowledge that sometimes the things we choose not to see have their own way of demanding attention. The call came at 8:47 the next morning, interrupting Margaret's second cup of tea and the crossword puzzle she'd been working through with methodical persistence. The voice on the other end belonged to a cheerful receptionist from Dr. Reynolds' dermatology practice. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Janet from Central Valley Dermatology. Nurse Mitchell called yesterday about scheduling you for an evaluation. Dr. Reynolds has an opening this Friday at 2 o'clock if that works for you." Margaret had expected to wait at least a week, possibly longer. The speed of the scheduling felt both reassuring and slightly ominous, as if her situation required more urgency than she'd realized. "Friday would be fine," she said, reaching for the small calendar she kept by the phone. "Is there anything I should do to prepare? Just avoid putting any creams or lotions on the area Dr. Reynolds will be examining. And bring a list of any medications you're currently taking." After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly with her tea, absorbing the reality that in 3 days she would have answers to questions she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to ask. The spot on her back had transformed from a minor annoyance into the central organizing principle of her week. She spent Friday morning in a state of careful preparation that reminded her of the way she'd approached important occasions throughout her life. Weddings, job interviews, the serious conversations that shaped relationships and determined futures. She chose a shirt that would be easy to remove, gathered her insurance cards and medication list, and arrived at the dermatology office 15 minutes early. Dr. Reynolds turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of steady presence that suggested years of delivering news, both good and difficult. Her examination was thorough and silent, using not only the dermatoscope, but also taking several digital photographs and making careful measurements. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Reynolds said finally, settling into the chair beside the examination table. "I can see why Nurse Mitchell wanted me to take a look at this. The lesion has several characteristics that concern me." The word lesion again, but this time accompanied by the more troubling word concern. Margaret felt her attention sharpen in the way it had during Robert's illness, when medical conversations required careful listening for both what was said and what was carefully not said. What kind of characteristics? The borders are irregular, there are multiple colors present, and the asymmetrical shape fits a pattern we take very seriously in dermatology. I'm going to recommend a biopsy. Biopsy landed in Margaret's consciousness like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread outward in concentric circles of possibility. She'd heard the word countless times during Robert's treatment, always in contexts that suggested the crossing of a threshold from uncertainty into medical territory that demanded action. "What exactly does that involve?" Dr. Reynolds explained. "The procedure, with the careful thoroughness that good doctors used when patients needed both information and reassurance. We'll numb the area with local anesthetic and remove a small sample of the tissue for laboratory analysis. It's done right here in the office, takes about 15 minutes, and you'll be able to drive yourself home afterward. And the tissue goes to a pathologist who will examine it under a microscope and provide us with a definitive diagnosis. We should have results within a week." Margaret found herself asking the question she'd been avoiding since her appointment with Sarah. "Are you thinking this might be cancer?" Dr. Reynolds met her gaze directly. "It's certainly possible. The appearance is consistent with melanoma, which is why I want to move quickly with the biopsy. But I've also seen lesions that looked concerning turn out to be benign. The only way to know for certain is to examine the tissue itself." The word melanoma hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Margaret recognized but hadn't fully prepared to bear. During Robert's illness, she'd become familiar with medical terminology, but always as a supporting character in someone else's health crisis. Being the primary focus of such clinical attention felt surreal and oddly isolating. "How quickly can we do the biopsy? I can do it right now if you're comfortable proceeding. I have time in my schedule, and frankly, I'd prefer not to delay." Margaret felt a moment of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. She'd arrived expecting a consultation, perhaps some advice about monitoring the spot, maybe a follow-up appointment in a few months. Instead, she was being offered immediate medical action based on concerns that sounded increasingly serious. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to call my son first. Let him know what's happening." "Doctor." Reynolds nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready." In the small consultation room adjacent to the examination area, Margaret dialed David's number with fingers that felt slightly unsteady. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the distraction of someone pulled away from work. "Mom, how did the dermatologist appointment go?" "The doctor recommends a biopsy. She says the spot has characteristics that need to be examined more closely." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Margaret to hear the sounds of David's office in the background. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the ordinary noise of business continuing, while personal crises unfolded in examination rooms and consultation areas across the country. "A biopsy," David repeated, and Margaret could hear him shifting into the more focused attention that serious conversations required. "Did she say what she's concerned about?" She mentioned melanoma as a possibility, but she also said that concerning looking. "Spots can turn out to be nothing serious. The biopsy is the only way to know for certain." "Are you okay? I mean, how are you handling this?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I'm scared," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "But I'm also grateful that we caught it early, if there's something to catch. Do you want me to drive up? I could be there by this evening." The offer was tempting, but Margaret recognized that accepting it would represent a significant shift in how she managed difficult situations. For 5 years, since Robert's death, she'd prided herself on handling life's challenges independently. Calling for help now felt like admitting that this situation was beyond her capacity for self-reliance. "Let me get through the biopsy and see what the results show. If it turns out to be something serious, then yes, I'd appreciate having you here. Promise me you'll call if you need anything at all." After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly in the consultation room, looking at the educational posters on the walls that illustrated various skin conditions with clinical photographs and careful explanations. The images were matter-of-fact in their presentation of medical realities, but they also served as a reminder that bodies could harbor serious problems while their owners went about their daily routines in blissful ignorance. When she returned to the examination room, Dr. Reynolds was preparing the instruments for the biopsy with the efficient movements of someone who performed such procedures routinely. "Have you decided?" "Yes, I'd like to proceed." The biopsy itself proved less dramatic than Margaret had anticipated. The local anesthetic eliminated any pain, reducing the procedure to a series of sensations: pressure, tugging, the sound of the small instrument removing tissue that had been part of her body moments before. Dr. Reynolds narrated each step, explaining what she was doing and why, maintaining the kind of calm, professional commentary that helped patients remain oriented during medical procedures. "I'm removing a sample that includes the entire lesion, plus a small margin of normal-appearing tissue around it. This gives the pathologist the best chance to make an accurate diagnosis." Margaret found herself watching the ceiling tiles while Dr. Reynolds worked, counting the small holes in the acoustic material and trying to maintain the steady breathing that would keep anxiety from escalating into something more difficult to manage. "All finished," Dr. Reynolds announced, applying a small bandage to the site. "You'll want to keep this dry for 24 hours, and then you can shower normally. The stitches are dissolvable, so you won't need to come back to have them removed." Margaret prepared to leave. Dr. Reynolds handed her a sheet of instructions for wound care and a business card with a direct phone number. "I'll call you personally as soon as I have the pathology results. Try not to spend the next week worrying about things that might not happen. You've done everything right by having this checked promptly." Walking to her car, Margaret felt as though she'd crossed an invisible threshold. The woman who'd entered the dermatology office that afternoon had been someone dealing with a minor skin concern. The woman leaving carried the weight of genuine uncertainty about her health and her future. The small bandage on her back felt disproportionately significant, like a flag marking territory that was no longer entirely her own. The week that followed the biopsy stretched before Margaret like a suspension bridge she had to cross without being able to see the other side. She'd experienced waiting for medical results during Robert's illness, but always as the anxious spouse, gathering information to help someone else navigate treatment decisions. Being the patient herself required a different kind of endurance, one that she was still learning to manage. On Saturday morning, she found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, longer than usual, trying to catch a glimpse of the bandaged area on her back. The small square of medical tape seemed to pulse with significance, marking the spot where a piece of her body had been removed for scientific examination. She wondered about the tissue sample now sitting in some laboratory, waiting to reveal secrets that would determine the shape of her immediate future. Dorothy called just after breakfast, her voice carrying the careful cheerfulness that people used when they weren't sure whether they were interrupting good news or bad. "How are you feeling today, dear?" "Physically, I'm fine. The biopsy site doesn't hurt at all. Mentally, I'm trying to stay occupied while I wait. That's the hardest part, isn't it? The not knowing." Margaret appreciated Dorothy's directness. Too many people, she'd learned during Robert's illness, approached medical uncertainty with relentless optimism that felt both forced and exhausting. Dorothy understood that sometimes the most helpful response was simply acknowledging the difficulty of the situation. Dr. Reynolds said she'd call with results sometime this week. "I keep catching myself listening for the phone. Why don't you come over this afternoon? I'm making soup, and we could work on that jigsaw puzzle I started last month. Keep your hands busy." The invitation felt like a lifeline. Margaret had spent too much of the weekend alone with her thoughts, cycling through worst-case scenarios and rational reassurances in an exhausting loop that resolved nothing and accomplished little, beyond wearing down her emotional reserves. Dorothy's kitchen smelled like chicken broth and herbs, a combination that immediately made Margaret feel more grounded. The jigsaw puzzle spread across the dining room table depicted an English country garden in full bloom. 1,000 pieces of roses, lavender, and winding stone paths that required patience and methodical attention to detail. "I find puzzles soothing when I'm worried about something," Dorothy said, settling into her chair and immediately locating a piece of blue sky. "Your mind has to focus on the immediate task, but it's not so demanding that it prevents you from talking through whatever's bothering you." As they worked, Margaret found herself describing the events of the past week with more detail than she'd shared with anyone, including David. Something about the rhythmic search for matching pieces and Dorothy's unhurried listening created space for her to articulate fears she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. "I keep thinking about Robert's diagnosis," Margaret admitted, fitting together two pieces of garden wall. "How quickly everything changed once we had that first concerning test result. One day we were planning a vacation, and the next day we were researching oncologists. Dorothy nodded, her fingers continuing to sort puzzle pieces by color and pattern. But Robert's situation was different. He had symptoms that had been building for months. You found this spot early and had it checked right away. I know that. Logically. But there's something about waiting for pathology results that brings back all those feelings of life being suddenly out of control. Have you thought about what you'll do if the results are concerning? The question was one Margaret had been avoiding, as if making plans for a difficult diagnosis might somehow make it more likely to occur. But Dorothy's matter-of-fact tone made it feel like a reasonable topic for discussion rather than an invitation to catastrophic thinking. I suppose I'd need to learn about treatment options, find the right doctors, figure out how to tell David and my sister in a way that wouldn't panic them unnecessarily, and if the results are good. Margaret paused, realizing she'd spent significantly less time considering this possibility. I guess I'd feel relieved and grateful, maybe more aware of how much I take good health for granted. As the afternoon progressed, they completed a significant section of the garden's central flower bed, their conversation meandering through topics both serious and mundane. Dorothy shared updates about her ongoing battles with the Homeowners Association, while Margaret described a book she'd recently finished about a woman who'd taken up painting at age 70. It's interesting, Margaret mused, examining a piece that might belong to either a rose bush or a section of brick pathway. How a medical scare makes you think differently about time, not in a morbid way, but more awareness of how you're spending your days. What do you mean? I realized I've been living very carefully since Robert died. Small routines, low risk, not much adventure or spontaneity. It felt like the sensible approach to being on my own, but now I'm wondering if I've been too cautious. Dorothy looked up from the puzzle. What would less cautious look like? The question caught Margaret off guard. She'd been so focused on the mechanics of waiting for test results that she hadn't considered what she might want to change if she received good news about her health. I'm not sure. Maybe travel somewhere I've always wanted to see. Take a class in something I've been curious about. Reach out to people I've lost touch with over the years. Or, Dorothy suggested gently, you could do some of those things while you're waiting for results. Might be a better use of nervous energy than sitting around worrying about things you can't control. The idea had an appealing logic to it, but also felt slightly reckless. Margaret had spent 5 years organizing her life around predictability and emotional safety. The prospect of introducing uncertainty voluntarily, especially while already dealing with medical uncertainty, felt like tempting fate. That evening, she found herself looking through a box of photographs she'd stored in the closet after Robert's death. Images of vacations they'd taken, parties they'd hosted, adventures that had seemed routine at the time, but now appeared remarkably bold. In one photo, they were standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, their arms around each other's waists, both grinning at the camera with the unconscious confidence of people who assumed they had unlimited time for future adventures. She studied her younger self in the photograph, a woman who'd been willing to stand at the edge of enormous canyons, who'd trusted that her body would carry her safely through hiking trails and airplane flights and all the small risks that traveling required. When had she become someone who approached a simple medical appointment with such trepidation? The phone rang at 9:30, startling her out of her reminiscence. David's voice carried the careful tone he'd adopted since learning about the biopsy. Just checking in. How are you holding up? Better today. I spent the afternoon with Dorothy, working on a puzzle and talking through some of my concerns. That sounds helpful. Any word from the doctor? Not yet. She said sometime this week, which could mean anywhere from tomorrow to Friday. I've been thinking about what you said, about not needing me to drive up until you have more information. I respect that, but I want you to know the offer stands. I can rearrange my schedule if you change your mind. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for David's approach to the situation. He was offering support without pushing, respecting her independence while making it clear that help was available if she wanted it. Thank you. That means more to me than you might realize. I think I'm managing the uncertainty better than I expected, but it's comforting to know I don't have to manage it alone." After hanging up, Margaret returned to the photographs, but now she found herself looking at them differently. Instead of seeing evidence of a braver, younger self, she began to recognize continuity. The same person who'd been willing to explore new places and try unfamiliar experiences. That person was still available to her if she chose to reconnect with that part of herself. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for early October, the kind of weather that made Margaret remember why she'd fallen in love with this part of the country 30 years ago. She'd awakened with unusual energy, as if her body had decided to rebel against the anxious waiting that had characterized the previous few days. After her usual breakfast routine, she found herself standing in her living room, looking at the stack of travel brochures she'd collected over the years, but never acted upon. Dorothy's suggestion about using nervous energy constructively had been percolating in her mind, and this morning it felt less like reckless behavior and more like reasonable self-care. The brochure on top featured photographs of Scotland, rolling, green hills, ancient castles and stone cottages that looked like illustrations from fairy tales. She and Robert had talked about visiting Scotland someday, but someday had been perpetually postponed in favor of more practical concerns, home improvements, and the comfortable assumption that they had unlimited years ahead for such adventures. Margaret picked up the phone and dialed the number of Sunrise Travel Agency, the small firm that had arranged her honeymoon 43 years ago. The same woman, Helen, still worked there, now with silver hair and reading glasses, but the same enthusiasm for matching people with destinations that would expand their understanding of the world. "Margaret Henderson," Helen said warmly. "I haven't heard from you since Robert's memorial service. How are you doing?" "I'm well, Helen. Actually, I'm calling because I've been thinking about taking a trip somewhere I've never been. Maybe Scotland or Ireland, something with history and beautiful landscapes." "How wonderful. There's nothing like travel to remind us how large and interesting the world is. Are you thinking of going alone, or would you be traveling with someone?" The question highlighted a reality Margaret hadn't fully considered. For most of her adult life, travel had meant coordinating with Robert's schedule, his preferences, his comfort level with various destinations and activities. The prospect of planning a trip entirely according to her own interests felt both liberating and slightly overwhelming. "Alone, I think. Is that feasible for someone my age?" Helen's laugh was warm and reassuring. "Margaret, some of our most adventurous travelers are women in their 60s and 70s. There are excellent tour companies that specialize in small groups, comfortable accommodations, and itineraries designed for people who want to see the world without roughing it unnecessarily." They spent 20 minutes discussing possibilities: a 2-week tour of Scotland's Highlands and Islands, a cultural journey through Ireland's literary landmarks, or a combination trip that would include both countries. Helen promised to put together some detailed proposals and send them over within a few days. After hanging up, Margaret felt a combination of excitement and mild panic. She'd committed to nothing more than looking at travel options, but even that felt like a significant departure from the careful, predictable routine she'd maintained since Robert's death. The phone rang at 11:15, displaying Dr. Reynolds's office number on the caller ID. Margaret's heart rate accelerated as she answered, her voice sounding more breathless than she'd intended. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Dr. Reynolds. I have your biopsy results." The pause that followed felt enormous, as if the entire trajectory of Margaret's future was balanced on whatever words would come next. The pathology report shows that the lesion was indeed melanoma, but we caught it very early. The good news is that it appears to be what we call a thin melanoma, less than 1 millimeter in depth, which gives us an excellent prognosis. Margaret Felt as though she were listening to Dr. Reynolds from a great distance, the words arriving in her consciousness with a slight delay that made processing them difficult. Melanoma was the word she'd been dreading, but excellent prognosis suggested that the catastrophic scenarios she'd been imagining might not be necessary. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that with the biopsy we performed, we may have removed all of the cancerous tissue. However, I want to do what's called a wider excision, removing a small additional margin of tissue around the biopsy site to make absolutely certain we've gotten everything. Another surgery? A minor outpatient procedure, similar to what we did last week, but slightly more extensive. We'll also need to check your lymph nodes to make sure the melanoma hasn't spread. But given how thin the original lesion was, I'm optimistic that everything will be clear. Margaret found herself taking notes on the back of an envelope, trying to capture the medical terminology and timeline that Dr. Reynolds was explaining. The conversation felt both crucial and surreal, as if she were taking notes about someone else's medical situation. How quickly do we need to do this? I'd like to schedule the wider excision within the next 2 weeks. The lymph node evaluation can be done at the same time. After that, assuming everything looks good, we'll put you on a regular monitoring schedule to watch for any new developments. And the monitoring would involve what exactly? Visits every 3 months for the first year, then every 6 months for several years after that. We'll examine your skin thoroughly each time and teach you what to look for at home. The vast majority of people with thin melanomas like yours never have any further problems, but we want to stay vigilant. After scheduling the wider excision, for the following Thursday, Margaret sat quietly in her kitchen, absorbing the strange combination of relief and concern that came with having definitive information. She had cancer, but a kind that had been caught early and carried a good prognosis. She would need additional surgery, but nothing as extensive or frightening as what she'd witnessed during Robert's treatment. She called David first, practicing, in her mind, how to present the information in a way that would be honest but not alarming. "The biopsy results came back," she began when he answered. "It is melanoma, but Dr. Reynolds says we caught it very early and the prognosis is excellent." David's response was immediate. "I'm coming up tonight. I can be there by 7. "David, you don't need to. Mom, you have cancer. I'm your son. I'm coming." The firmness in his voice reminded Margaret of conversations they'd had when he was a teenager, negotiating curfews and responsibilities with the same matter-of-fact determination he was displaying now. She realized that accepting his help might be less about her need for support and more about his need to contribute something meaningful to her situation. "All right, I'd actually appreciate having you here for the next procedure." Her next call was to Dorothy, who listened to the medical update with the same practical attention she brought to most of life's challenges. "Well," Dorothy said when Margaret finished explaining the situation, "it sounds like you're dealing with the best possible version of a difficult diagnosis." "That's what Dr. Reynolds said. I keep feeling like I should be more upset or frightened, but mostly I'm relieved to finally know what we're dealing with. And grateful, I imagine, that you didn't wait longer to have it checked." Margaret thought about the weeks she'd spent ignoring the spot, convincing herself it was nothing worth worrying about. "Very grateful. It makes me realize how many things I might be overlooking or postponing unnecessarily." "Speaking of which, did you follow up on any of those travel ideas we talked about?" "Actually, I did. I called Helen at the travel agency this morning before I got the test results. She's putting together some proposals for trips to Scotland and Ireland." Dorothy's approval was immediate and enthusiastic. "That's wonderful. When are you thinking of going?" "I'm not sure yet. I suppose it depends on how the next surgery goes and what the recovery involves." Margaret paused, considering the strange timing of planning a dream vacation on the same day she'd learned she had cancer. "It feels odd to be thinking about travel when I'm dealing with medical issues. It sounds perfectly sensible to me. You've got something to look forward to, Something to celebrate when you get through the treatment phase. Life is meant to be lived, Margaret, not just endured. David arrived at Margaret's apartment that evening, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing the determined expression she remembered from his childhood. The look he'd worn when tackling difficult homework assignments or preparing for important conversations with teachers or coaches. He'd inherited Robert's methodical approach to problem-solving, but with an emotional directness that had always made him easier to read than his father. "I brought ingredients for dinner," he announced, setting the bags on her kitchen counter. "Salmon, fresh vegetables, and that sourdough bread you like from the bakery near my office. I figured we should talk through everything while I cook." Margaret watched her son move around her kitchen with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple priorities simultaneously. At 41, David had the kind of career success that came from combining intelligence with persistence, but he'd also retained the warmth and attentiveness that had made him such a pleasant child to raise. "You don't have to take care of me," she said, settling into a chair at the small table where she took most of her meals. "The surgery is minor outpatient procedure. I'll be home the same day. I'm not here because you need taking care of," David replied, washing vegetables with the same thorough attention he applied to most tasks. "I'm here because I want to understand what you're dealing with so I can be helpful in whatever way makes sense." As he prepared dinner, Margaret found herself describing her conversation with Dr. Reynolds in more detail than she'd provided during their phone call. Speaking the medical terms aloud, melanoma, wider excision, lymph node evaluation, made the situation feel more real but also more manageable, as if articulating the facts reduced their power to create anxiety. "What's your sense of Dr. Reynolds?" David asked, seasoning the salmon with herbs and lemon. "Do you feel confident in her expertise?" "She's thorough and direct without being alarming." Sarah, the nurse practitioner, spoke very highly of her. "And her approach seems exactly right, taking the situation seriously without treating it as a crisis." "Good. That matches what I found when I looked her up online. She's board certified, has excellent credentials, and the reviews from patients are consistently positive." Margaret wasn't surprised that David had researched her doctor. He'd inherited Robert's tendency to gather information as a way of managing uncertainty, but unlike his father, he shared his findings rather than keeping his concerns private. They ate dinner while discussing practical matters, how long the wider excision would take, what the recovery would involve, when she might expect to have definitive results about the lymph nodes. David approached each topic with the same systematic attention he brought to analyzing business problems, breaking complex situations into manageable components that could be addressed individually. "Have you thought about telling Aunt Susan?" he asked, referring to Margaret's younger sister, who lived in Arizona with her husband of 35 years. "I should call her soon. I wanted to have more complete information before I worried her unnecessarily. She's going to want to know, regardless of how minor the surgery turns out to be. And knowing Susan, she'll be hurt if she finds out you kept something this significant to yourself." David was right, of course. Susan had always been the more emotionally expressive of the two sisters, quick to offer support and equally quick to feel excluded if important family news was shared belatedly. Margaret had been postponing the conversation not because she doubted Susan's caring response, but because she wasn't prepared for the intensity of concern that her sister would undoubtedly express. "I'll call her tomorrow," Margaret promised, "after I've had time to process today's information myself." As they cleaned up after dinner, David raised a topic that Margaret had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts. "Mum, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll consider it carefully before answering. Would you like me to be your primary contact for medical information? Someone who can help you navigate decisions if things get more complicated than we're expecting?" The question touched on territory that Margaret had been reluctant to examine. Since Robert's death, she'd prided herself on managing her affairs independently, finances, household maintenance, medical appointments and all. the other responsibilities that couples typically shared. Accepting David as a formal advocate felt like acknowledging limitations she wasn't ready to admit. I appreciate the offer, but I think I'm managing fine on my own. David dried the last dish and turned to face her directly. I'm not suggesting you can't handle things yourself. You're obviously doing a great job of staying on top of your health and making good decisions. But sometimes it helps to have someone else listening when doctors are explaining treatment options or test results. A second set of ears. An advocate who can ask questions you might not think of. Margaret considered his words while wiping down the kitchen counters. During Robert's illness, she'd served exactly that role, taking notes during medical appointments, researching treatment options, helping him formulate questions for doctors. Having someone perform that function for her had obvious advantages, but it also represented a shift in her relationship with David that felt both natural and unsettling. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "Maybe we could start with you coming to the wider excision appointment and see how that feels." That sounds like a reasonable approach. Later that evening, as David settled into the guest room that had served as Robert's home office, Margaret found herself reflecting on how the day's events had shifted her perspective on independence versus accepting help. For 5 years, she'd organized her life around the principle of self-reliance, viewing it as both a practical necessity and a source of personal dignity. But having David present during difficult conversations about her health had felt supportive rather than diminishing, collaborative rather than dependent. She retrieved the travel brochures from Helen and spread them across her dining room table, studying photographs of Scottish castles and Irish countryside, while considering how a cancer diagnosis might affect her newfound interest in adventure. The timing seemed either perfectly appropriate or completely inappropriate, depending on how she chose to interpret the situation. David emerged from the guest room in pajamas and reading glasses, carrying the laptop he'd brought to finish some. "Work emails before bed. What are you looking at?" "Travel brochures. I called a travel agent this morning, before Dr. Reynolds called with results, and asked her to put together some proposals for trips to Scotland or Ireland." David sat down across from her at the table, examining the colorful photographs with the same attention he'd given to her medical information earlier. "These look amazing. When are you thinking of going?" "I'm not sure. I suppose it depends on how the next few weeks go medically." "Or," David suggested, "you could think of it as something to look forward to once you're through the treatment phase. A celebration of good health and new possibilities." Margaret looked at her son, recognizing in his expression the same blend of practicality and optimism that had made him such a steady presence throughout his life. "You think I should do it? I think you should do whatever makes you feel excited about the future. Life doesn't wait for perfect timing, Mom. Sometimes you have to create your own adventures." The wider excision procedure took place on a Thursday morning under local anesthesia in the same outpatient surgery center where Margaret had her initial biopsy. David sat in the waiting area with a legal brief he'd brought from work, but Margaret noticed he spent more time watching the door to the surgical suite than reading the documents in his lap. Dr. Reynolds had explained that the procedure would involve removing an additional centimeter of tissue around the original biopsy site, along with a small sample from a nearby lymph node to check for any spread of the melanoma. The entire process was expected to take less than an hour, but the implications of what they might find during the surgery carried weight that Margaret felt in her chest as the anesthesia took effect. She awoke in the recovery area feeling groggy, but surprisingly comfortable, with a bandage on her back that felt more substantial than the small dressing from the biopsy. Dr. Reynolds appeared beside her bed as the nurse was checking her blood pressure and monitoring her emergence from sedation. "Everything went very well," Dr. Reynolds said, settling into the chair beside Margaret's bed. "The tissue around the original site looked completely normal to my eye, and the lymph node sample was small and straightforward to obtain. We should have pathology results within a week. How are you feeling about what you saw during the surgery? Optimistic. The area around your original melanoma appeared healthy, which suggests we removed all of the cancerous tissue with the first biopsy. But we'll know definitively once the pathologist examines everything under the microscope. Margaret nodded, trying to process medical information while her mind was still clearing from the anesthesia. David appeared in the recovery area as doctor. Reynolds was finishing her explanation, and Margaret felt grateful to have someone present who could ask the practical questions she wasn't yet ready to formulate. "What should we expect during the recovery period?" David asked. "The incision is slightly larger than the biopsy site, so healing will take a bit longer. Probably 2 to 3 weeks before she's back to normal activities. No heavy lifting or swimming until the sutures heal, but walking and light household activities are fine. And if the pathology results are good, then we'll move to the monitoring phase I mentioned before. Regular skin exams every 3 months initially, then every 6 months for several years. For thin melanomas like your mother's, caught this early, the vast majority of people never have any further problems." That evening, Margaret found herself experiencing an unexpected emotional reaction to having completed the surgical phase of her treatment. During the weeks of waiting for test results and planning for procedures, she'd maintained focus by concentrating on the next immediate step. Now that the surgery was behind her and she faced another week of waiting for final pathology results, she felt a delayed wave of anxiety about what she'd been through. David seemed to recognize her emotional state without her having to articulate it. He prepared a simple dinner of soup and sandwiches, put on a classical music station that filled the apartment with gentle piano pieces, and settled into the living room chair adjacent to hers without feeling the need to maintain constant conversation. "It's normal to feel unsettled after surgery," he said during a quiet moment between musical pieces. "Even minor procedures. Your body has been through something significant, and it takes time to process that physically and emotionally." Margaret appreciated his matter-of-fact acknowledgement of what she was experiencing. During Robert's illness, she'd learned that sometimes the most helpful response to medical anxiety was simply having it recognized and normalized, rather than dismissed or minimized. "I keep thinking about the pathology results," she admitted. "Logically, I know that Dr. Reynolds seemed optimistic, but there's still that possibility that they'll find something concerning." "There is," David agreed. "But there's also the much more likely possibility that everything will be clear and you'll be able to move on with whatever comes next in your life." "Whatever comes next," Margaret repeated, considering the phrase. "I've been so focused on getting through this medical situation that I haven't given much thought to what I want to do afterward." "Well, there are those travel brochures on your dining room table," Margaret smiled, remembering her impulsive call to the travel agency. "Helen sent over some detailed proposals yesterday. I haven't looked at them yet. I wanted to get through the surgery first. Would you like to look at them now? Might be a good distraction while we wait for bedtime." They spread the travel documents across the coffee table, examining itineraries that featured visits to Edinburgh Castle, drives through the Scottish Highlands, tours of Irish literary sites, and stays in converted manor houses that promised both comfort and authentic atmosphere. Margaret found herself drawn to a 2-week tour that combined both Scotland and Ireland, with small group sizes and accommodations that prioritized charm over luxury. "This one looks perfect for you," David said, pointing to the same itinerary Margaret had been studying. Small groups, cultural focus, beautiful landscapes, and reasonable physical requirements. "When would you want to go?" Helen suggested either late spring or early fall. "Better weather, fewer crowds, and the countryside is supposed to be especially beautiful during those seasons. So we're talking about next May or September." Margaret noticed David's use of "we" and realized he was thinking about the trip as a family milestone rather than simply her individual adventure. "You think I should commit to something that far in the future when I don't know yet what my medical follow-up will require?" "Mom, if your pathology results are good, You're going to be monitoring your health for years, not recovering from ongoing treatment. There's no medical reason you couldn't travel next spring or fall. And frankly, having something to look forward to might be exactly what you need right now. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself looking forward to the morning, in a way she hadn't experienced since before discovering the spot on her back. The surgery was behind her, the pathology results would arrive when they arrived, and in the meantime she had travel brochures to study and decisions to make about adventures she'd never seriously considered before. The small bottle of pain medication Dr. Reynolds had prescribed sat unopened on her nightstand. The surgical site was tender but not painful, and Margaret felt more interested in maintaining clear thinking than in medicating discomfort that was entirely manageable. She wanted to be present for whatever came next, whether it was challenging news that required careful attention or good news that deserved full celebration. Before turning off the light, she looked once more at the hand mirror on her dresser. The woman reflected there appeared tired but determined, someone who had navigated a medical scare with reasonable grace and was beginning to contemplate what lay beyond the immediate crisis. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt curious about her future rather than anxious about it. The call from Dr. Reynolds came on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the wider excision surgery. Margaret had been reading in her favorite chair, occasionally glancing at the clock and calculating how many hours remained in the business day when medical offices typically delivered test results. When the phone rang at 3:15, she felt her attention sharpen with the familiar combination of anticipation and dread that had become routine during this period of waiting. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Dr. Reynolds. I have your pathology results, and I'd like to discuss them with you. Are you available to talk now?" Something in the doctor's tone made Margaret sit up straighter in her chair. During previous conversations, Dr. Reynolds had maintained a warm, straightforward manner that conveyed both professionalism and reassurance. This time, her voice carried a subtle weight that suggested the conversation would require careful attention. "Yes, I'm available. The pathology report shows that the additional tissue we removed was completely clear of melanoma, which is excellent news. However, the report also revealed something unexpected that I want to discuss with you." Margaret felt her heart rate increase as she tried to interpret the significance of finding something unexpected in tissue that was supposed to be healthy. What kind of unexpected finding? The pathologist identified some cellular changes in the deeper layers of your skin that aren't related to the melanoma but do warrant further investigation. They're called atypical melanocytes, abnormal pigment cells that can sometimes be precursors to additional skin cancers. The words seemed to arrive in Margaret's consciousness with a slight delay, as if her brain needed time to process information that didn't fit the narrative she'd been expecting. She'd prepared herself for either complete reassurance or news. That the melanoma had spread, but not for the discovery of additional unrelated concerns. "Are you saying there might be more cancer?" "Not necessarily. Atypical melanocytes exist on a spectrum. Some are completely benign and never develop into anything concerning, while others can progress to malignancy over time. The challenge is that we can't predict which category these particular cells fall into without additional testing." Margaret reached for the notepad she'd been keeping by the phone for medical conversations, her hand trembling slightly as she tried to write down terms she was hearing for the first time. "What kind of additional testing?" "I'd like to refer you to an oncological dermatologist, a specialist who focuses specifically on skin cancers. Dr. Patricia Huang at the University Medical Center has extensive experience with complex melanoma cases and the latest diagnostic techniques for evaluating atypical cells." The word oncological carried implications that made Margaret's careful optimism feel suddenly naive. She'd been prepared to celebrate clear pathology results and move forward with planning her Scottish adventure. Instead, She was being introduced to medical terminology that suggested her situation was more complicated than anyone had initially realized. How serious is this development? Dr. Reynolds paused in a way that Margaret had learned to recognize. As a doctor, choosing words carefully, it's impossible to know without more specialized evaluation. What I can tell you is that Dr. Huang has techniques for analyzing these cells that go beyond standard pathology. She can determine more precisely what we're dealing with and what kind of monitoring or treatment, if any, might be appropriate. Treatment? Potentially. If the atypical cells show signs of progression toward malignancy, she might recommend additional surgical removal or other preventive measures. But she might also determine that simple monitoring is sufficient. The point is to get the most expert opinion possible about what these findings mean for your long-term health. Margaret found herself asking questions she hadn't anticipated needing to formulate. How long would it take to get an appointment with Dr. Huang? What kind of procedures might be involved in the specialized evaluation? Were there any symptoms she should watch for in the meantime? Dr. Reynolds answered each question with the thorough professionalism Margaret had come to appreciate, but the conversation felt fundamentally different from their previous discussions. Instead of moving toward resolution, Margaret was being introduced to a new level of medical complexity that might require months of additional appointments and procedures. "I'll call Dr. Huang's office this afternoon and explain your situation," Dr. Reynolds concluded. "Given the complexity of your case, they should be able to see you within the next 2 weeks. In the meantime, try not to worry too much about possibilities we can't yet define. You've done everything right by having your skin changes evaluated promptly." After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly in her chair, trying to process information that seemed to change the entire trajectory of her medical situation. The travel brochures on her dining room table now seemed like artifacts from a more innocent time, when she'd believed that successful surgery would mark the end of her cancer concerns, rather than the beginning of a more complex journey. She called David first, practicing in her mind how to explain the new development without causing unnecessary alarm. "The pathology results were mixed," she began when he answered. "The area around the melanoma was completely clear, but they found some other abnormal cells that need to be evaluated by a specialist." David's questions were immediate and systematic, the same approach he'd used throughout her medical situation. What kind of abnormal cells? What did the specialist evaluation involve? How soon? Could she be seen? "It sounds like you're dealing with a more complex situation than any of us expected," he said, after she'd shared what she understood about atypical melanocytes and oncological dermatology referrals. "I think I should plan to come with you to the appointment with Dr. Huang." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for David's steady presence throughout her medical journey. "I'd appreciate that. This conversation felt more technical than I was prepared to handle on my own." "Of course. And Mom, I know this isn't the news you were hoping for, but it's still fundamentally good news. They found something that needs attention, and you're getting referred to exactly the right kind of specialist to address it." Her next call was to Dorothy, who listened to the update with characteristic practical attention before offering her perspective on the changing medical landscape. "It sounds like your doctors are being extremely thorough," Dorothy said. "That's exactly what you want when you're dealing with something as serious as skin cancer. But I thought we were past the serious part. The surgery was supposed to be the end of treatment, not the beginning of more complex medical issues." "Maybe," Dorothy suggested gently. "This is just a more thorough version of the careful monitoring Dr. Reynolds mentioned. Better to investigate anything questionable now than to wonder about it later." Margaret appreciated Dorothy's attempt to frame the development positively, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her medical situation had taken a turn toward complexity that she wasn't prepared to navigate. The simple narrative of early detection and successful treatment had been replaced by something that sounded more like the beginning of a chronic condition requiring ongoing management. That evening she found herself looking through the box of photographs again, but this time with a different emotional context. Instead of seeing evidence of adventures she might still be capable of pursuing, she saw reminders of a time when her body had been reliable and predictable, when medical appointments were routine rather than sources of life-changing information. The travel brochures remained spread across her dining room table, but they now seemed to mock her earlier optimism about planning adventures for the following spring. How could she commit to international travel when she didn't know what kind of medical monitoring or treatment the next few months might require? As she prepared for bed, Margaret caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something that surprised her. Not fear or defeat, but a quality of determined attention that reminded her of how she'd looked during the most challenging periods of Robert's illness. She was entering uncharted medical territory, but she'd navigated difficult health situations before, even if she'd been the supporting character rather than the patient. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who could handle whatever information Dr. Huang might provide, someone who had learned that medical complexity didn't necessarily mean medical catastrophe. For the first time since receiving Dr. Reynolds' call, Margaret felt ready to face whatever came next. Dr. Patricia Huang's office at the University Medical Center occupied an entire floor of a modern building that hummed with the quiet efficiency of cutting-edge medical research. Margaret arrived 30 minutes early for her appointment, accompanied by David, and carrying a folder containing all of her pathology reports, surgical notes, and the detailed list of questions they'd prepared together the previous evening. The waiting area differed significantly from the comfortable, residential atmosphere of Dr. Reynolds' clinic. Here, the walls displayed certificates and awards related to melanoma research, published studies about innovative treatment approaches, and photographs of Dr. Huang speaking at international conferences. Margaret felt simultaneously reassured by the evidence of expertise and intimidated by the clear indication that her case had moved beyond routine dermatological care. David sat beside her, occasionally checking his phone, but mostly observing the steady flow of patients and medical staff with the same systematic attention he'd applied throughout her medical journey. Margaret appreciated his presence more than she'd expected, not because she couldn't handle the appointment alone, but because having a witness to complex medical information felt prudent given the stakes involved. Mrs. Henderson, a young resident, in a white coat, approached with the kind of respectful attention that suggested he'd been briefed about her case. "I'm Dr. James Park. I'll be working with Dr. Huang during your evaluation today. Would you like to come back to our consultation room?" The consultation room contained equipment Margaret hadn't seen before. Digital imaging systems, specialized microscopes, and computer monitors that could display magnified images of skin tissue in extraordinary detail. Dr. Huang proved to be a woman in her 40s with an air of focused intelligence and the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with complex medical situations. "Mrs. Henderson, I've reviewed your pathology reports and the images Dr. Reynolds sent over. You've been dealing with a particularly interesting case that illustrates why we take melanoma so seriously, even when it's caught early." Dr. Huang settled into her chair and opened Margaret's file on the computer screen, displaying magnified images of tissue samples that looked like abstract art to Margaret's untrained eye. "Let me explain what we're seeing in your pathology results. The original melanoma was indeed thin and completely removed with the first biopsy. That part of your treatment was entirely successful. However, the atypical melanocytes we found in the surrounding tissue represent something we encounter in about 15% of melanoma cases." Margaret felt David shift beside her as he prepared to take notes, and she was grateful for his systematic approach to gathering information during medical conversations that could determine the direction of her healthcare for years to come. "What exactly are atypical melanocytes?" David asked. They're pigment-producing cells that show abnormal characteristics under microscopic examination, but haven't yet developed into full malignancy. Think of them as cells that are partway along the path, from normal to cancerous, but we can't predict whether they'll continue progressing or remain stable indefinitely. Dr. Huang turned to the computer screen, pointing to areas in the magnified tissue images that illustrated the cellular changes she was describing. To Margaret, the images looked like intricate patterns of light and shadow, but Dr. Huang's explanation helped her understand that she was looking at evidence of her body's cellular activity magnified thousands of times beyond normal vision. The big challenge, Dr. Huang continued, is determining the appropriate response to these findings. Conservative monitoring might be sufficient if the cells remain stable, but if they show signs of progression, early intervention could prevent the development of additional melanomas. Margaret found herself asking the question that had been weighing on her mind since Dr. Reynolds's call. What would early intervention involve? Potentially additional surgery to remove tissue containing the atypical cells, followed by more intensive monitoring. But before we make any treatment decisions, I want to use some diagnostic techniques that weren't available when your original biopsy was performed. Dr. Huang explained that she wanted to perform what she called advanced dermoscopy and reflectance, confocal microscopy, procedures that would allow her to examine Margaret's skin at the cellular level without requiring additional tissue removal. The evaluation would take about 2 hours and provide detailed information about the behavior and characteristics of the atypical cells. When can we schedule these procedures? Margaret asked. I have time this afternoon, if you're available. The techniques are non-invasive, so there's no recovery period required. You could have the evaluation done today and potentially have preliminary results by early next week. Margaret felt a familiar sense of medical time compression, the way serious health concerns accelerated normal decision-making processes and compressed weeks of contemplation into moments of immediate choice. She looked at David, who nodded. Encouragingly, I'd like to proceed this afternoon, she said. The advanced dermoscopy procedure resembled an extremely sophisticated version of the dermatoscope examination Dr. Reynolds had performed, but with digital imaging that allowed Dr. Huang to capture high-resolution photographs of suspicious areas and analyze them using computer software that could detect subtle patterns invisible to human observation alone. Margaret lay on the examination table while Dr. Huang methodically examined her back, arms, and other areas where sun exposure might have created additional atypical cells over the decades. The process was painless but thorough, with Dr. Huang occasionally pausing to take detailed photographs or make notes about particular findings. I'm seeing several areas of interest, Dr. Huang said as she worked. Nothing that appears immediately alarming, but definitely some cellular changes that warrant documentation and monitoring. The reflectance confocal microscopy proved more complex, involving a specialized device that could examine skin tissue to a depth of several cell layers without requiring surgical removal. Margaret found herself fascinated despite her anxiety, as Dr. Huang explained what the real-time images were revealing about her cellular activity. This technology allows us to see how cells are behaving, whether they're dividing rapidly, showing signs of genetic instability, or displaying other characteristics that might indicate progression toward malignancy. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret began to understand that her medical situation was more nuanced than she'd initially realized. Rather than simply having cancer or not having cancer, she was dealing with a spectrum of cellular changes that required ongoing evaluation and potentially preemptive intervention. David remained present throughout the procedures, asking technical questions that helped Margaret understand the implications of what Dr. Huang was discovering. His legal training had taught him to gather comprehensive information before making important decisions, and he applied the same methodology to navigating his mother's medical care. What we're documenting today Dr. Huang explained as she completed the evaluation, will serve as a baseline for future comparisons. If the atypical cells remain stable over time, we can be comfortable with continued monitoring. If they show signs of progression, we'll have detailed information to guide treatment decisions. How often would monitoring appointments be scheduled? Margaret asked. Initially every 3 months, with complete photographic documentation of any areas of concern. As we establish patterns of stability or change, we might extend the intervals between appointments. Margaret realized that her relationship with medical care was shifting from the occasional routine checkup to something more resembling chronic disease management. The prospect felt daunting but not overwhelming, more like accepting a new responsibility than confronting an insurmountable challenge. Dr. Huang, David said as they prepared to conclude the afternoon's evaluation, what's your clinical impression? Based on what you've seen today, Dr. Huang paused thoughtfully before answering, and Margaret appreciated her evident commitment to providing accurate rather than reassuring information. I think your mother is dealing with what we call field cancerization, an area of skin that has sustained enough sun damage over decades to create multiple sites of cellular abnormality. The original melanoma was the most advanced of these changes, but there are other areas that require ongoing attention. Is that a common situation? More common than people realize, especially in patients with fair skin and significant lifetime sun exposure. The good news is that we have excellent tools for monitoring these changes and intervening before they progress to invasive cancer. As they left the medical center that evening, Margaret felt as though she'd received a graduate-level education in the complexity of skin cancer prevention and treatment. The simple narrative of successful melanoma removal had been replaced by a more sophisticated understanding of ongoing risk management, but also by confidence in the medical tools available to address that risk. How are you processing everything? We learned today, David asked as they drove back toward Margaret's apartment. It's more complex than I expected, but also more manageable than I feared, Margaret replied. Dr. Huang seems to know exactly what she's dealing with, and the monitoring approach makes sense given what we now know about my cellular situation. And it doesn't change your fundamental prognosis. The original melanoma was caught early and completely removed. Everything else is preventive care. Margaret nodded, appreciating David's ability to identify the essential point within the mass of technical information they'd absorbed. Exactly. I'm not dealing with active cancer treatment. I'm dealing with sophisticated cancer prevention. That realization felt like a shift from medical crisis to medical partnership, from passive patient to active participant in her own long-term health management. The travel brochures on her dining room table no longer seemed like artifacts from a more innocent time, but rather like reasonable plans for a future that would include both adventures and medical appointments, both spontaneous decisions and careful health monitoring. Dr. Huang's call came on a Friday morning, 8 days after the comprehensive evaluation at the University Medical Center. Margaret had been watering her plants when the phone rang, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had become her body's automatic response to medical conversations over the past 2 months. Mrs. Henderson, I have the complete analysis of your advanced dermoscopy and confocal microscopy results. I'd like to discuss them with you. Are you available to talk now? Margaret settled into her chair, reaching automatically for the notepad. She now kept permanently beside the phone. Yes, I'm ready. The results are quite interesting and, I think, more encouraging than we might have expected based on your initial pathology findings. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt her shoulders relax slightly. Dr. Huang's tone carried a warmth that hadn't been present during their technical discussions at the medical center. The detailed imaging shows that while you do have scattered atypical melanocytes in the area around your original melanoma, they appear to be stable rather than progressing toward malignancy. The cellular characteristics we can measure, division rates, genetic markers, architectural patterns, All suggest benign changes rather than precancerous evolution. Margaret found herself writing down phrases she didn't entirely understand. But that sounded remarkably positive compared to the ominous possibilities she'd been contemplating. What does that mean for treatment? It means we can manage your situation with careful monitoring rather than additional surgery. I'd like to see you every 4 months for the first year, then every 6 months after that, assuming the cellular patterns remain stable. No more procedures, not unless something changes significantly in the areas we're monitoring. The advanced imaging will allow us to detect any progression very early, but based on what I'm seeing now, I'm optimistic that we're dealing with sun damage that has reached a stable endpoint rather than ongoing malignant transformation. Margaret felt as though Dr. Huang was speaking a different language from the one she'd used during their previous conversations. Instead of complex medical uncertainty, she was hearing something that sounded remarkably like reassurance based on scientific evidence. Dr. Huang, can I ask you directly, do you think I'm going to develop more skin cancers? It's impossible to predict with absolute certainty, but the pattern I'm seeing suggests that your skin has sustained significant cumulative sun damage that resulted in one melanoma and several areas of cellular abnormality that appear to have stabilized. With proper monitoring and sun protection going forward, I think your prognosis is quite good. After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly in her living room, absorbing information that seemed to represent a fundamental shift in her medical trajectory. For 2 months, she'd been living with escalating concerns about her health, moving from minor skin spot to melanoma diagnosis to complex cellular abnormalities requiring specialized evaluation. Now suddenly, she was being told that careful monitoring would likely be sufficient to manage her situation. She called David immediately, eager to share news that felt genuinely positive for the first time since her initial appointment with Sarah at the clinic. The results are good, she said as soon as he answered. Dr. Huang says the abnormal cells appear stable and we can manage everything with regular monitoring rather than additional surgery. David's relief was immediately audible. That's wonderful news, Mum. How are you feeling about it? Relieved? Obviously, but also a little disoriented. I'd been preparing myself for a much more complex medical situation, and now it sounds like I'm dealing with something quite manageable. That's exactly what you want to hear. You've been through a thorough evaluation by one of the best specialists available, and she's telling you that the situation is under control. Margaret realized that Dr. Huang's call had resolved not only her immediate medical concerns, but also the broader question of how to plan her life going forward. The travel brochures on her dining room table were no longer symbols of optimistic thinking that might prove unrealistic. They were practical options for someone whose health was stable and whose future was her own to design. David, I think. I'm going to book that trip to Scotland and Ireland. Really, that's fantastic. When are you thinking? Helen suggested late spring would be ideal, May or early June. The weather should be beautiful, and I'd be well established in my monitoring routine with Dr. Huang by then. I think that's a perfect plan. Something to look forward to, and a way to celebrate getting through this medical uncertainty. Margaret spent the rest of the morning looking through the detailed travel itineraries Helen had prepared, but now, with the focused attention of someone making actual plans, rather than indulging in wishful thinking. The 2-week tour that combined Scotland and Ireland included visits to Edinburgh Castle, drives through the Highlands, tours of literary sites in Dublin, and stays in historic hotels that promised both comfort and authentic atmosphere. For the first time since discovering the spot on her back, Margaret felt genuinely excited about her future rather than anxious about it. She had a medical situation that required ongoing attention, but not ongoing crisis management. She had a son who had proven himself to be a steady and supportive advocate during difficult times. And she had the possibility of adventures she'd never seriously considered before confronting the reality of her own mortality. Margaret called Helen at the travel agency that afternoon, her voice carrying a decisiveness that surprised even her. "Helen, I'd like to book the Scotland and Ireland tour for May. The 2-week itinerary we discussed with the small group size and the historic accommodations." "Margaret, that's wonderful. I'm so pleased you've decided to take this adventure. Let me pull up the details and we can go through everything together." As Helen described the specifics, departure dates, group composition, included meals and optional excursions, Margaret found herself paying attention in a way that felt entirely different from her previous approach to travel planning. Instead of the cautious consideration she'd applied to most decisions since Robert's death, she was responding with enthusiasm that reminded her of planning their honeymoon decades earlier. The group is limited to 16 travelers, mostly people in their 60s and 70s who are interested in history, literature, and beautiful landscapes rather than adventure sports or nightlife, Helen explained. "It sounds like exactly the right pace and focus for what you're looking for." "It sounds perfect. What do I need to do to confirm my reservation?" After handling the practical details of booking and deposits, Margaret spent the evening studying the detailed itinerary Helen had sent over. The tour would begin in Edinburgh, with 3 days exploring the city's historic castle, Royal Mile, and literary connections. Then they'd travel north through the Highlands, visiting ancient castles, scenic lochs, and small villages that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The Irish portion would focus on Dublin's literary heritage, with visits to sites connected to Joyce, Yeats, and Shaw, followed by drives through the countryside that had inspired generations of poets and writers. The accommodations ranged from converted castles to historic manor houses, each chosen for its combination of comfort and authentic atmosphere. Margaret realized that she was planning not just a vacation, but a celebration, a way to mark her transition from medical patient to someone whose health concerns were manageable and whose future was open to possibilities she'd never seriously considered before. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from her sister Susan in Arizona. "Margaret, I just got off the phone with David. He told me about your melanoma diagnosis and all the medical appointments you've been dealing with. Why didn't you call me weeks ago?" Margaret felt a familiar guilt about her tendency to manage difficult situations privately before sharing them with family members who might worry unnecessarily. "I wanted to have complete information before I concerned you with something that might turn out to be minor. Cancer is never minor, even when it's caught early. I should have been supporting you through this whole process. You can support me now by being excited about what comes next," Margaret said, realizing as she spoke that she was ready to share good news rather than medical concerns. "The specialist says everything looks stable, and I've decided to take that trip to Scotland and Ireland I've been thinking about for years." Susan's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "That's the best news I've heard in months. Tell me everything about your plans." As Margaret described the tour itinerary and her decision to book the May departure, she found herself articulating a perspective on her recent medical experience that surprised her with its clarity. "Going through the cancer diagnosis made me realize I've been living too carefully since Robert died. I've been so focused on not taking risks that I forgot how to embrace opportunities. I think this trip sounds like exactly the right way to celebrate your good health and your courage in facing down a scary medical situation." That afternoon, Margaret walked to Dorothy's apartment to share her news and her travel plans. Dorothy was working in her small garden, tending to the late-season flowers that had survived the first light frost. "I have news on 2 fronts," Margaret announced, as Dorothy looked up from her chrysanthemums. "The medical results are good, and I'm going to Scotland and Ireland in May." Dorothy's smile was immediate and genuine. "Both of those developments sound wonderful. Tell me about the medical results first." As Margaret explained Dr. Huang's assessment and the monitoring plan that would replace additional surgery, Dorothy nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose advice about taking health concerns seriously had proven sound, And now you get to plan an adventure instead of worrying about medical procedures, Dorothy said. That seems like perfect timing. It feels like I'm reclaiming something I didn't realize I'd given up. The ability to make plans based on what I want to experience rather than what I'm afraid might happen. They spent the rest of the afternoon looking through Margaret's travel materials, with Dorothy sharing stories about her own trips to Ireland 30 years earlier and expressing enthusiastic approval for the literary focus of Margaret's planned itinerary. You're going to come back with so many stories and probably a completely different perspective on what's possible in your life, Dorothy predicted. As Margaret walked home that evening, she felt as though she was seeing her neighborhood with fresh eyes. The familiar streets looked the same, but she was observing them as someone whose future held both medical monitoring and international adventure, both careful attention to health concerns and deliberate pursuit of experiences she'd never allowed herself to seriously consider. 6 months later, Margaret stood on the ramparts of Edinburgh Castle, looking out over a city that sparkled in the clear Scottish morning light. The view stretched for miles across rolling green hills dotted with sheep, stone villages, and patches of forest that looked exactly like the photographs in Helen's travel brochures, but somehow more vivid and three-dimensional than any image could capture. Her traveling companions, 14 other Americans ranging in age from 58 to 74, were scattered along the castle walls, taking photographs and reading from guidebooks about the battles and ceremonies that had taken place on these ancient stones. Margaret had expected to feel somewhat isolated as a solo traveler, but the group had welcomed her warmly, and she'd discovered the pleasure of exploring new places with people who shared her appreciation for history and beautiful landscapes. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" said Eleanor, a retired teacher from Oregon who had become Margaret's closest friend during the tour. "I keep thinking about all the people who have stood exactly where we're standing, looking out at this same view." Margaret nodded, touching the small scar on her back where Dr. Reynolds had performed the original biopsy nearly 8 months earlier. The spot was barely visible now, a tiny reminder of the medical journey that had led her to reassess how she wanted to spend her remaining years. Her quarterly appointment with Dr. Huang the previous month had confirmed that the atypical melanocytes remained stable, showing no signs of progression toward malignancy. The monitoring routine had become comfortable and routine. Detailed photographic documentation of suspicious areas, brief conversations about sun protection and skin changes to watch for, and scheduling of the next appointment before leaving. "The medical center, have you decided what you want to do when you get home?" Eleanor asked as they walked toward the castle's crown jewels exhibition. Margaret considered the question carefully. The trip had exceeded her expectations in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not just the beautiful scenery and fascinating historical sites, but the discovery that she was capable of navigating unfamiliar places, adapting to group dynamics, and embracing experiences that required flexibility and openness to surprise. "I'm thinking about taking a watercolor painting class," Margaret said. "Something I've been curious about, but never made time for. And maybe planning another trip." Helen mentioned some interesting options in New Zealand and Tasmania. "That sounds wonderful. It's amazing how travel can open up possibilities you hadn't considered before." That evening, as their group gathered in the lounge of their converted castle hotel for their final dinner in Scotland, Margaret found herself reflecting on the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. The stubborn spot on her back had seemed like such a minor inconvenience when she first noticed it. Now, it had led her not only to successful medical treatment, but to a fundamental reconsideration of how she wanted to live. She thought about the hand mirror on her dresser back home, and how it had served as both witness and accomplice to years of selective attention to the changes that time brought to her body and her life. The mirror would still be there when she returned, but she suspected she would look into it with different eyes, less concerned with avoiding uncomfortable realities, more interested in seeing herself clearly enough to make conscious choices. About what came next. David had called twice during the trip, checking in on her adventures and sharing updates about his own life. During their most recent conversation, he'd mentioned meeting someone new, a colleague who shared his interests in hiking and classical music. Margaret had felt genuine happiness for him, but also a recognition that his life was appropriately focused on his own future rather than managing hers. The independence she'd prized so highly since Robert's death had evolved into something more nuanced. The ability to accept help when it was needed and offer it when it was requested, but also the confidence to pursue her own interests and make her own decisions about how to spend her time and energy. On their last morning in Ireland, as their bus wound through countryside that looked like a living illustration of every Irish poem she'd ever read, Margaret realized that the medical scare that had initially felt like such an unwelcome disruption had actually been a gift of sorts. Without the diagnosis that forced her to confront her own mortality, she might have continued living cautiously for years, postponing adventures and avoiding risks until the opportunities had passed entirely. The flight home gave her time to organize the photographs she'd taken and the journal she'd kept throughout the trip. Looking through images of castles and countryside, historic libraries and literary sites, she saw evidence of experiences she'd never imagined herself having just months earlier. Dorothy met her at the airport, eager to hear about every detail of the trip and to see the small gifts Margaret had brought back: Scottish shortbread, Irish crystal, and a hand-knitted scarf from a shop in the Highlands. "You look wonderful," Dorothy said as they drove through the familiar streets of their neighborhood. "Rested and happy and somehow more yourself than you've seemed in years." "I feel more myself," Margaret agreed. "Or maybe more like the person I was before I became so careful about everything." That evening, unpacking in her apartment while classical music played softly from Robert's old radio, Margaret caught her reflection in the hand mirror on her dresser. The woman looking back at her appeared essentially the same as the one who had left for Scotland 2 weeks earlier, but her expression carried something new, a quality of anticipation and openness that hadn't been there before. The travel brochures for New Zealand were already waiting in her mailbox, sent by Helen as promised. Tomorrow, she would call Dr. Huang's office to schedule her next monitoring appointment. She would also call the community center about watercolor classes and start planning whatever adventure would come next. The spot on her back had healed completely, leaving behind only a small reminder of the medical journey that had changed her understanding of what it meant to take care of herself. Taking care, she now understood, meant not just protecting against risks, but also remaining open to possibilities. Even when those possibilities required courage she wasn't sure she possessed until she found herself standing on castle walls, looking out at landscapes she'd only dreamed of seeing.